Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and our chats with Emily as we are calling our readings through this Johnson edition of the 1,775 poems of Emily Dickinson. We're now at poem 14, One Sister Have I in Our House. Now, my assumption is that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist, and that you have already been through our introductory set of comments. Those are kind of important. And then I'm hopeful that you have already worked with us through the first 13 poems. We're going to make reference here to poem number 4, another one of those Sue Gilbert tribute poems. Some have called them love poems, as this one certainly will be often referenced as well. And we just finished in poem 13 with Sleep is Supposed to Be. Now, our background information here is interesting. The poem is actually the whole of a letter, 197 letter, to Sue Gilbert, who, of course, she came to Amherst in 1850. This maybe, scholars think, was a greeting to Sue on her 28th birthday, 19 December 1858. So think about that now. They've been together for 8 years. And you'll remember that Sue marries Austin, so Emily's best friend marries her brother, and they're living in the Evergreens, that house next door, and they're living, and Emily lives in the homestead, and they've been there now for 2.5 years, so that's a little bit more background information. And of course, her sister, Emily's actual sister, is Vinnie, and so there's some interesting discussion about this poem as to whether it's filled with some anxiety. Sewell actually has made some comments about the possibility of some anxiety here, versus celebration, especially of Sue. Let's just enjoy the poem. One sister have I in our house, and one a hedge away. There's only one recorded, but both belong to me. One came the road that I came, and wore my last year's gown. The other, as a bird her nest, builded our hearts among. So she did not sing as we did, it was a different tune. Herself to her a music as bumblebee of June. Today is far from childhood, but up and down the hills I held her hand the tighter, which shortened all the miles. And still her hum, the years among, deceives the butterfly. Still in her eye the violets lie, mouldered this many May. I spilt the dew, but took the morn. I chose this single star from out the wide night's numbers. Sue, forevermore. Note that the exclamation point at the conclusion of this poem is the only exclamation point of the entire poem. Again, we've commented on Emily's love of these pieces of punctuation, and certainly here will make some sense. Now notice how the poem is constructed, first of all, to speak about her first sister, Vinnie, and then of course her second sister, Sue. And this tribute poem will take us back to poem number 4 already, where we had some referencing to Sue Gilbert. There's been a lot of debate about, of course, the relationship between Emily and Sue. Some will call them friends, some will call them lovers. Emily obviously makes it very clear how much she owes to Sue and how close she is to Sue. Notice, one sister lives in our house, that's Vinnie. Another is a hedge away on the other side, obviously, they live adjacent. There's only one recorded, but both, in this key word here, belong to me. Now what's problematic about that is that, of course, how can Sue, who is married to Emily's brother, Austin, belong to Emily? And some have read this as competition and the like. One came the road that I came, obviously Vinnie, right? And wore my last year's gown, in other words, younger sister. The other, and now we're going to get to this bird motif, there's a strong argument to be made that of all of the animal motifs in all of Emily, that the most strongest is the bird motif, and here it is. The other, as a bird her nest, builded our hearts among. It's an interesting simile. The idea of birds building nests. We're going to see this so regularly in her poetry. Notice our hearts, the idea of the community of hearts. And then something interesting about Sue. And some scholars have pointed out there may be some anxiety here about Sue and how she was the outsider right from the beginning. Notice, she did not sing as we did. Now, what exactly that means has been the subject of a lot of debate. In other words, she wasn't Dickinson. In other words, she wasn't from Amherst. In other words, she kind of lived and moved in different circles. It's always an interesting question. Notice it was a different tune. This immediately makes us think of Thoreau and the idea we've given full lectures at learnstrong.net on Walden, the idea that it marched to the beat of a different drum and all of that. It was a different tune. Herself to her a music. In other words, it's almost as if Sue was so confident in who she was as the second of the similes here, as Bumblebee of June. In other words, Sue is, now notice we move from birds to bees. Sue is this almost like an entity unto herself, right? And she has this amazing music. Now that's the past. The word today possibly takes us to 15 December 1858, right? This now, the immediacy when Sue is 28 years old. Today is far from childhood. In other words, we're 2 years from having lived 3 decades, right? But up and down the hills sometimes understood as obstacles, I held her hand the tighter. Some have read anxiety into this gripping idea, in other words, not wanting to let Sue go. Some have seen this as the mark of ultimate friendship. We obviously think of those final lines of Milton's Paradise Lost as Adam and Eve are hand in hand leaving Eden, right? Notice, I held her hand the tighter, which shortened all the miles. The miles here could be very much in, kind of like the same idea of the obstacles that we were referencing earlier of hills, right? In other words, hills and miles, the challenges of life. In other words, a good friend is going to help you get through the worst imaginable kinds of experiences, the hills, the miles. And still her hum. Now I have said this about Walt Whitman, and I'll say it about Emily Dickinson as well. I believe that T.S. Eliot learned to use the word still from his study of Whitman and Dickinson. We must be still and still moving into another intensity at the still point of the turning world. All of that notion of stillness. Notice here, still gets used twice. And still her hum. We're back to the music of the bumblebee. And still her hum. The years among. Notice the brilliance of the rhyming. Deceives the butterfly. It's fascinating to me the way she uses a word like deceives. To me, this is the core word. This is the key word of the poem. Deceives, the idea of deception. In other words, there seems to be buried in this poem a suggestion that the relationship that Emily has had with Sue is somehow the possibility of a deception. Still in her eye, after all these years, still in her eye the violets lie, moldered this many May. Now, notice this word May actually is a singular noun that is being forced to serve as a collective. In other words, it's more than a single May, it's Mays. The great biographer Whitcher has pointed out that Emily loves to do this kind of thing. And now, finally, to Emily herself with the pronoun, back to the pronoun I from the first line. I spilt the dew. Now, what exactly that means, so many different interpretations. In other words, I grew up is one way to say it, but took the morn. The argument here being, I'm capable of still remembering what's most valuable in the course of a lifetime if the day is the early part of the day, early part of life. I chose this single star. Notice this is I chose, as our hearts among, belong to me. I chose. Notice the empowerment. This single star. Notice we're going from birds to stars now, from birds to bees to stars, and star motifs all the way through Emily's poetry. From out the wide night's numbers, in other words, all of the potential stars, Sue forevermore. Now, the suggestion here has been made that this is really her referencing the North Star. In other words, Sue is like the North Star for Emily. Emily only needed one North Star, and it was Sue Gilbert, and this could be the reading of this poem. Certainly it works. At 2a, I think the primary message here is that true friends are life's greatest gift, and they are what one needs to hold on to closest. And yet, in Emily's circumstance, it appears that the study of the biography suggests that Sue was very close to Emily. Then Sue marries Emily's brother, and from that moment on, the relationship is a different type of relationship. At 2b, I love the question about the tone of this poem. Some have seen it as full of anxiety. Some have seen it as celebratory. It's certainly a tribute poem to Sue and sent to her maybe on her 28th birthday. At 3A, observations, comparisons, we've mentioned the poem number 4, another Sue tribute poem. I mentioned Milton's Paradise Lost in that final lines about holding hands. But I want to take us actually to a biblical allusion that I think most readers of Emily in the early years would have immediately gone to, because it's one of the classic texts of friendship from the biblical corpus. And of course, I'm thinking about 1 Samuel 18:1 and that close relationship between David and Jonathan. And the fact that that relationship somehow gets severed by someone in the middle. In the case, of course, of the story of David and Jonathan, it's Saul. So it's this kind of interesting dynamic of a family member getting in the way of a close relationship. Just at least go back and study that and then decide how you like to read this. Finally, at 3B, how are we going to own a poem like this? Well, I can ask it two ways. Who is the Sue in your life? Who is that close friendship whose music turns you on, makes you happy, makes you joy-filled? And then, are you a Sue to anyone at all in your life? Or is there somebody in your life who you serve as a Sue to as you march to the beat of your own drum? Thank you.